Good evening, everyone. My name's Julie Willis, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this event is taking place. We're on Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. Welcome and thank you all for joining us here tonight for this panel discussion on Victoria's future cities, suburbs and building reform. And a big thank you to the Association of Consulting Architects whose support has made this event possible. This evening's discussion aims to explore the current landscape of the Victorian building industry, shed light on its intricate challenges, and propose potential pathways towards developing Australia's best building system. I do need to convey the apologies of the Honourable Sonia Kilkenny, Victorian Minister for Planning, who is scheduled to present tonight. She is unfortunately unwell and no longer able to attend. We do hope she feels better soon. We nevertheless have a fantastic lineup of panellists here with us tonight, representing a number of different perspectives across the built environments. In a minute, I will hand over to Dr. Kirsten Day, who will tell you more about our panellists and what to expect this evening. Kirsten is a lecturer in technology and practice here in the faculty. Her teaching and research expertise includes architectural practice, applied design thinking, and design studio with a specialisation in design for neurodiversity. She leads the architecture stream for the ARC grant, the Australian Emulation Network, Born Digital Cultural Collections Access. Her publications, workshops, and studios explore themes of future scenarios and the impact of change on the architecture profession and the human condition. Please join me in welcoming Kirsten to the stage. Of course, I've gone the wrong way. Thank you, Julie. And thank you everyone for coming along tonight. It's good to see so many people who are interested in how we might start a collaborative discussion about construction reform. You may have noticed that we have moved into the larger theatre, which this event has quickly escalated from an intimate discussion of what we thought would be 60 people into something a little bit bigger. And also thank you to those who have provided your considered responses to our survey, from which we've curated tonight's discussion, and it's alerted us to the need for ongoing conversations on other large topics. The plan for our next version is to talk about education and training in the construction industry. For me, this conversation started with a seed grant from our faculty to explore the impact of novation on university projects. Unsurprisingly, our outcomes were not conclusive. There was no apparent logic, and it basically opened a can of worms. That can of worms then initiated many conversations, both here at the university, with fellow examiners for the registration board, members of the education committee for the Institute of Architects, and with industry colleagues. It appears that end-of-year drinks seem to be the time when revolutions are schemed. And my co-conspirators in this, Paul Viney, who's the Victorian Tasmanian President for the Association of Consulting Architects, our strategic advisor, Peter Lockett, and Peter Raisbeck, who cannot be here tonight because he's been delayed in Italy. By holding this event at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, we have chosen to independently position ourselves in a non-partisan policy space between industry and government. Having said that, I'd like to thank the ACA for sponsoring tonight's event. The purpose of tonight's forum is to discuss Victoria's building reform with the objective of providing a space for collaborative discussion, acknowledging that alone or in competition with each other, we will not solve this current crisis. So tonight's discussion revolves around a much needed reset. Over the past decade, our industry has undergone significant changes, and it's clear that reform is necessary. The Stage 1 final report to government, the expert panel on building reform, makes clear that our current regulatory system was developed over 30 years ago, resulting in a growing disconnect between the regulatory framework and with industry practice. The construction industry has grown increasingly complex, with the COVID-19 pandemic laying bare our shortcomings. We are confronted by unprecedented demand and face a media narrative of almost daily failures of our industry. And Stephen Long's Four Corners report on Monday night served as another stark reminder of the challenges that we face. And then we add to this a climate crisis that we continue to ignore to our peril. While overwhelming, we as construction industry professionals must tackle these issues if we're to meet the current demand and to continue to be an asset to the community and to the economy. Reports such as the Building Confidence Report, the Framework to Reform, the Stage 1 Final Report to Government's Expert Panel on Building Reform have made clear recommendations. The Stage 2 of that is recently been finalised with the third tranche underway. What we strive for is a construction industry that serves society with integrity, social responsibility, and ethical behaviour. I did write here, pause for sniggers from the audience, because we all read the news. The building construction industry is the fourth largest industry in Victoria, contributing to 56% of our state's tax revenue. But if we return to that idea about ethical behaviour, the lack of integrity has permeated various sectors, from ICACs and IBACs, the banks, PwC, the robo-debt scandal. In the construction industry, we have too many Phoenix companies that shuffle money around like a shell game, while those who put in the hours, paid for goods and services, made deposits, are left carrying both the economic and human cost. We find ourselves drowning in a sea of custom-made contracts with each project crafted individually. Standardisation and shared learnings are nearly non-existent, leading us to repeat the same mistakes. We have numerous reports that highlight the reality that our industry standards are plummeting, and we suffer from inadequate documentation, prevalence of unskilled trades, haphazard product substitutions, insufficient supervision, I'm about to cry now, in incomplete services, while all operating on razor-thin profit margins. It's a dire situation that calls for immediate attention. It's clear that the market alone can't resolve these issues. And for too long, we have operated in a fragmented environment, working in silos, with each group lobbying different government departments and ministers without proper communication between ourselves. We have failed to acknowledge the interconnected network that forms the construction industry. This also includes research done in our universities, research hubs, and think tanks. The construction industry is an interconnected web of developers, designers, builders, and suppliers, each playing a crucial role in shaping the economic and social fabric of our state. It's a vast and intricate network that requires recognition of these interconnections, where a single action in one part of the web reverberates through the entire system. This is precisely why governments turn to the construction industry when implementing stimulus packages. The ripple effect it generates is far-reaching and profound. So tonight we start that conversation. I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Peter Maddison. Peter is an award-winning architect and director of Maddison Architects. He's an ambassador for Melbourne Open House and Architects Without Frontiers. He's also the host of Grand Designs Australia. Welcome, Peter, and I'll let you introduce our panel.
Good evening, everybody. We're blessed tonight. We've got a salubrious panel that are going to join me. And if I could just go through perhaps you'd all like to come up straight away. Michaela Lihu, who's the CEO of the Master Builders Association of Victoria. Michaela is a member of the Building Industry Consultative Council, the BICC, and as an integral advocate as MBV, Master Builders of Victoria, and the industry, as they have navigated through unprecedented challenges. Welcome. Peter Elliott at the other end of the panel. Peter is a Melbourne architect, of course, and he's a recipient of the 2017 gold medal from the RAIA. And he's currently an adjunct professor of practice at the Faculty of Art and Design and Architecture at Monash University. In 2015, Peter was awarded an honorary Doctor of Architecture by the Melbourne University. Tom, who's sitting next to me, Tom Travaskis, is the CEO of Burbank Property Group. Tom's got 18 years experience in property development and has managed all phases of land development from acquisition, deal structuring, planning, developing and implementing sales and marketing strategies and delivery, just about everything, Tom. So with this panel, we're going to try and in the next 45 minutes or so, just delve into this nutty problem about Melbourne growing exponentially at warp speed, and how we house all the people who are going to come here, and the complexities of the building industry and how that knits together with the explosion we're experiencing here in Victoria and Australia for that matter. The Minister was going to be here, as Kirsten mentioned a moment ago, and we're going to pose certain questions to her about the recent passing, or the first tranche of the new Act, which is going to change the planning and building systems in Victoria. And just June, which has just passed, the Building Legislation Amendment Act has gone through both houses of Parliament, and it's going to change a lot, excuse me, a lot of aspects of our industry here in Victoria. Now, we don't have the Minister, but we do have some experts in the audience. And I was going to call on Andrew Greer, who I just put the hard word on him 5 minutes ago, who's sitting just up here on my left. And if I could get a microphone to Andrew from someone, please. So I was going to pose the question to Andrew about this latest change in the legislation around this Building Legislation Amendment Act, and how things will change because of this. So, Andrew, if you could contribute to this a little bit, please.
Thanks. And yeah, firstly, I'm here on my own. I wasn't going to be speaking, not here on behalf of the department, but I can contribute by saying the legislation was passed on the 6th of June. As you quite rightly said, it's the first tranche. It's born out of the first report of the expert panel on building reform. Their second report is with the government at the moment, and they're considering that. And there will also be a third stage of that, which is talking about new legislation, a new legislation construct, I think is probably the way that Anna Cronin would refer to it. Noting that Anna, of course, is was the chair of the expert panel and has now moved down to be CEO of the Victorian Building Authority. And that probably says something in and of itself as well. 5 quick things out of the bill. First one, there's the setting up of a building monitor, and that will come into play, once the administration's done, I would expect by the end of the year. Basically someone who can have some oversight of the system and provide regular commentary to government in terms of changes that should be there, and also look to get an aggregation of data, which currently it's very difficult to find out what's going on because you have to jump between a range of places. Second thing is some expanded industry registration in terms of practitioners in the space. Third thing is some subtle changes to the Architects Registration Board.
Are we going to have architects in the registration board?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's if those that have read the legislation and will see the commentary that's there, yes,
Good.
that is the case. Fourth thing was information statements by building surveyors. So in other words, some documentation once the building is actually completed, so that consumers have access to that information. All of you in the room who have been consumers, try and find out the details about how your building is built. Obviously not as difficult in tier 1 construction, but certainly in domestic construction. And finally, that leads into the requirement for building manuals as well. So a set of documents that talk about how the building was put together, what the details of that are. That's just a quick summary.
That's terrific. Thank you. So what we're seeing here is government recognition that the industry needs to change. And as described, it's a process that the government's going through. But as of June, there's something marked in the sand, which is yet to be totally finalised. So I guess the industry itself has been frustrated by the complexities of delivering quality and sustainable buildings here in Victoria, and the government's starting to act, but there's still a way to go. So we're here to discuss the whole issue of that delivery process. So this is probably a question to Michael, who's sitting on my right. If I could get a microphone to Michael Adams, he's the RAIA Education Committee expert. So, Michael, considering that all states and territories are confronted by comparable challenges, New South Wales has emerged as a gold standard. How do we move to reinstate Victoria as a leading state for the construction industry?
Look, I think the reforms as they were expounded in the building confidence report that was delivered in 2018.
Can everyone hear Michael? No, speak right. It's a bit closer to the mouth.
How's that better?
That's working.
Sorry.
That's working.
I can hear me coming back now. So as it's developed in New South Wales, it's what it's focused on is making sure that people like architects are carrying through right through the design and construction process, which is a change in the sense particularly related to the construction of multi-storey apartment blocks. I think the report focused on the problems with that particular building type because of the problems that were caused by, in the obvious problem with the cladding. And but what's also emerged is a lot of poor construction and poor supervision in complying with the National Construction Codes. So a lot of my work in the last few years, apart from sitting on the Education Committee, is working with owners of failed buildings in rectifying those problems. It seems to me, reading the reform implementation statements, that it's going to require architects and engineers and other design players to have to be engaged to carry through from start to finish and to certify the design as it goes to make sure that any changes are monitored and documented properly.
Yeah, that's great, Michael. And I think I just want to pass to Paul Viney. Where are you sitting, Paul? Just over here. Paul's the current president of the ACA Victoria and Tasmania. And I might even grab David Wagner. I think I saw you walk in a moment, David. Just ask your question, which I was going to address to the Minister, but the government's policy response to the building construction industry is dispersed across various ministries currently, each with its own distinct perspective and priority. Is there a potential, or is it intended to enhance the integration of policy response to effectively address this substantial sector of the economy?
Difficult question, Peter, but I think if we can look at what's happening in the state is probably the best example. And we've got in Queensland, we have a Minister for Public Works. In New South Wales, we now have a Minister for Construction. So it has been consolidated in other states. And one of the frustrations that the industry has here is the number of different approaches depending on which department you're dealing with. Their cross policy, the way in which the contracts are structured, and then not consistent across departments, the way in which submissions are put in are not consistent across departments. And one of the biggest frustrations that, again, I'll just use an example of a builder I spoke to the other day, and he talked about the way in which the industry has gone over the last 15 years. And he said, I feel like from the day I signed the contract is the day they start throwing rocks at me. He said, we used to have the 4 C's. He said it was collaboration, cooperation, coordination, and construction. And we worked together as a team. He said that is now lost. He said, what's happening is that we're being asked to take on board risks that we have no ability to manage. For example, latent conditions on sites where we're being asked to guess what might be in the ground, and anything that comes up, we're now subject to that. So we're having to try and price that in an extraordinarily difficult period. We've got a situation where, say, for example, the VSBA are changing the contract to take out the fair and reasonable out of the contract. It seems to be that we're pushing risk to parties that are less able to carry it. And that's, I think, one of the big problems. And I think that's where it's got to be sorted out as a single entity. It can't be done through multiple departments.
So, Paul, we're going to get into these issues with the panel in a moment, but in recognition of the minister's absence, I think there's a government recognition that the industry is not perfect. They're moving towards trying to rectify this. And I guess if we can tease out some of those issues individually and dig down with the panel here. And I'd like to start, well, just give you a summary of what we'll discuss, and that's procurement, regulation, value, knowledge, and the future. And these topics I'm going to talk to the panel about came out of the Melbourne University survey. So let's just look at procurement, which is, you were just intimating the difficulty of that currently. And procurement's innovation, basically. And recently in 2022, the Institute of Architects took an important piece of work developing a code of novation. And the report identified that 64% of architects in this state were deriving over half of their revenue from novated design and construct contracts. So there's anecdotal evidence from the ARVB examiners that there is a general de-skilling of architecture candidates around contract administration skills because of this. And so this was typical for larger practices, but now with the popularity of novation as a procurement method being standardised, as you say, Paul, with the VSBA, Victorian School Building Authority, that really delivers a lot of work to Victorian architects. This has a significant impact on the experience of graduates across the spectrum of practice sizes. So, Pete, Elliot, I want to throw this question to you if I can. How do we develop good procurement decision making for both clients and owners, including government, while delivering quality outcomes? So is the novation of architect's role a good thing, or is novation just about value management?
Well, a big, hard question, I think.
I knew you'd be up for a tough one.
Yeah, that's all right. Introduction, 50 years in practice, so I've seen an awful lot of change over 5 decades, and at the moment I'm fatigued, fatigued with the amount of change. The thing that it strikes me is that there's so much sort of poor procurement process, so much lack of understanding about the way you get a quality building. And we've got incredible, Melbourne's architecture, as we know, is outstanding. And there's great examples, but there's also, very poor process. We get contracts now, we get invitations, we just send them back. They're just so poorly prepared, and we just know we cannot deliver a proper project. The skilling thing is an issue as well. I mean, I'm of a generation where we went to site every day. We went to the factories. We understood building process, and I've got older guys in the practice who hand draw still and know those things. The young guys really go onto site and they don't get exposed to contract administration, as you say. And so there is a lack of feedback. So the way we learn as architects is what we draw is what gets built, more or less. And therefore, if you don't understand the implications of what you've drawn, then you can't improve your documentation. So we're very reluctant in novation. In fact, we rarely do it. I know that's not common in the profession. I think a lot of it, we try and advise our clients not to go that way. It's kind of false economy, because what we see is fees being driven down, partial services, poor documentation. It leads to the very problem we've got. So, why don't people see that? And why don't governments and those that commission sort of return to something which is more reasonable, less risk averse, less risk transition, and not bottom dollar? So that's how you get it.
Michaela, you're shaving it a bit to say something here.
Yeah, I just think I want to add to that is, I guess, the builder's lens that sits in that equation as well. And the point was raised before about the challenge with which the environment we're operating in, when you've got the client, be it government or another body, who they're pushing that risk all the way down. And what's happening is that risk is going to the builder, and then the builder is then passing that down to the subcontractor. And you're in a situation where that subcontractor potentially doesn't have the means or the understanding of actually what the risks they are that they're signing up to. And it's a race to the bottom around whoever can deliver the project for the cheapest amount without not necessarily knowing the risks that they're about to enter into.
I think it's interesting. There's a few different things. I think people, when we have this debate around novation, it's more around large scale commercial residential projects where risk can be novated down, and the cost of capital in the last year or two, we've gone from sub 5% to double digit cost of capital. So when you push that risk down through the contractor, through the subcontractor, and further down where they can't control those risks, it's just priced in, and projects are not commercial to get out of the ground. And
could you explain what risks? We're saying risk.
Yeah,
so
we talk about
everyone understands what that
latent
means.
conditions on the ground, contamination risks, liquidated damages, there's things that people can control and things that people can't. And when I think there's a view, from a financier through to a developer, through to a head contractor, that they don't want to carry the risk, so it's pushed down and down and down, and then it's priced in, and there's an inability to control that risk, so projects are not feasible. And at the moment, it's interesting, and I sort of want to get back to the broader debate around the planning policy framework as well. But in Melbourne at the moment, I think the City of Melbourne has 21,000 dwellings that are approved, ready to go, and can't come out of the ground because they don't commercially stack. So there's a market acceptance to the product and what the customer is willing to pay, but there's also a reality of what's happening in the contract environment and the lending environment on what lenders are putting on developers to actually make these projects feasible. The other thing I'd say is around what's happening in the government space around cost plus contracts and the impact that has on the industry more broadly. So a lot of the big infrastructure projects are led on a cost plus model, and that's not in the private sector. That's not a reality. A civil contractor in a tier 2 space can't go to a developer and say, I'm going to say it's cost plus my costs is, I think it's about $1 million, but I'll put 10% margin on it, and it'll be what it'll be, and I'll pass that through. They can't then go to an end customer who's buying a house on that subdivision or on that development and pass that through. So we've got a situation where there's a section of the market, and particularly in the big infrastructure spend, that's operating in a cost plus environment. And then in the tier 2, tier 3 space, that's operating in a more traditional approach that can't pass through that cost plus arrangement to the end user.
Does everyone understand what the cost plus arrangement is? Does anyone not understand it?
Guaranteed margin.
Okay. Guaranteed margin as opposed to a lump sum contract.
That's right. And
explain what that is.
Yeah. And so under a lump sum contract, you're motivated to ensure that your costs are in line with what you tendered. But under a cost plus arrangement, the costs are the costs and the margin are the margin.
So it's an open-ended deal for the builder.
That's
where
right.
he can, and the client's got no idea where the price will end up.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. So what's the solution with procurement? Where are we going to go with it? Or where's it going?
I was going to say, one of the things that we're doing at Master Builders at the moment is working with a lot of the builders to try and understand, could we get to a point where we would actually have a standard contract that we can work with government on, so that we can work out what is a fair risk allocation throughout that process and try and alleviate some of the challenges that have been spoken about of every different department doing their own thing, which would also bring cost savings back to projects, etc., because you're not then having to pay for additional legal fees, etc., all the time to review things.
Yeah, I agree completely. We just inundated every EOI submission that comes with the same sort of general parameters, but they're completely different. Like every contract, some of them are in hundreds of pages, and
they're often written by people that don't understand the building industry.
Right, and they're driving the risk out to the point where you know what they're doing. And so there was a period when there was sort of general 2 or 3 standard contracts around for everything we did. Now that's completely gone. And that's one of the huge risks for everyone operating in the industry, is you're not understanding, and you can never understand until something goes wrong, what these contracts actually mean. So I think a return to some more standardized forms of contract, and it can be done, like instead of everybody getting their own lawyer to write their own contract, that's mad. And it's contributing to this problem we have, I think, of lots of, we have 30% of bankruptcies in Victoria are in the construction industry, and it's the poor subbies at the bottom, but there's a lot of other people caught in it as well.
Thanks, Peter. That leads straight on to the next issue that I was going to discuss around regulation. And, it's because of the risks in building, unreliable supply chains, COVID, and unwieldy compliance regulation and regulation standards that is affecting the industry. So, aside from the known issues we now face to manage climate change, the shift in regulated standards is enormous. So, take, Peter, as you pointed out, Green Star, which is currently 20% reduction. It's going to go to 40% by 2030. Or, as you pointed out, the MCC amendment regarding sustainable building design at the Melbourne City Council is now being embedded in the planning scheme. And I'm going to quote you here, Pete, that you're suffering from reform fatigue, complexity fatigue, and compliance fatigue. He's getting worn out. We're all getting worn out. So, and then there's the loopholes in compliance regulation. So, and we're catching up on the issues which Paul was mentioning around structural issues, Mascot Towers in Sydney, and the combustible cladding fiasco, which Ted knows all about. So, and now it's crumbling outdoor decks and water inundation. So, the government is undergoing reform, and the process is underway. But there's a whole raft of them, isn't there? There's this act which has just come out. There's the Australian Building Codes Board, Building Confidence Report, updating the NCC 2020 National Construction Code. There's Victorian Building Authority initiatives, Design Standards Working Group, etc., etc. So these are all looking at ways to reduce building defects, but all acting independently. So the question I'm going to put to Michaela is, how do we regulate in a way that maintains standards, manages those risks, but fosters innovation without being overly complex?
That's a big question in its own right. Look, I think part of it is we need regulation, but it needs to be about setting those minimum standards and making it easy for people to understand so that they can actually go about implementing it. And I mean, if you overlay on top of the handful of different regulations you've put there, then go and throw OHS regulations and IR reform changes, etc. There's a lot for practitioners to continually have to come to grips with when they're trying to run a business on top of trying to deliver a project. So having things like mandatory CPD across the whole industry, that's all the way down to trades, that will make a massive impact. And as much as it can be polarizing for some, that idea, but what it'll help to do is if there are issues that are identified and regulations whereby the industry or participants in the industry are not keeping up to spec. And, the examples recently with Cladding Victoria and their findings through their works around balconies, etc., and the water ingress. Yes, it's the trade at the end that has delivered that, but at the same point, the education and around those regulations needs to go all the way back to the designers and the architects, etc., so that everybody's knowledge of that problem and the regulation is at the same point.
I'll answer the question, but I might just take a little bit of a step back because I think like change fatigue is real and the rate of change, but I think the timing of change is really, really important. And I might, and some people in the room might understand this. I think we're in a really interesting point in Australia, but particularly in Victoria, where we've got a situation we don't have a demand issue in Victoria. We've got record 195,000 people into Australia last year, about 30% of that into Melbourne. The Infrastructure Victoria put out a report earlier this year and said we need 45,000 dwellings a year through to 2050. So
just about 1 million new dwellings.
Substantial growth is coming to Melbourne, and we need to accommodate that growth. There's been a shift, and it's disappointing the Planning Minister's not here to talk about the policy objectives of the state, but there's been a real shift in sentiment and direction from the state government around how we accommodate that growth in Melbourne. And many people might have heard about 70-30 policy, so 70% of that in infill, brownfield areas, 30% on the city fringes. And traditionally that's been sort of 50-50 roughly. And when at times of peak demand, that's skewed even higher towards greenfield growth. So now that's trying to be accommodated in middle ring Melbourne. To put that into context, that's 30,000 homes that needs to be rezoned in middle ring Melbourne a year. I think Arden, which is about 6,000, took 6 years to rezone. They need 5 of those a year just to accommodate the growth. So it's transformative change. So we're talking about iterative changes to the regulation at a sort of building level. We need transformative change at a policy level for planning to unlock growth. Because if we don't do it, marketing fundamentals, if demand outstrips supply, we're going to have an affordability issue. And I think we're on the cusp of that now. There's affordability issues now. The differential between prices in middle ring Melbourne versus outer greenfield's about $1 million. It's sort of 1.6, 1.7 in middle ring. It's 750 grand or thereabouts on the fringe, and a customer coming in and choosing isn't really balancing up choosing a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in Box Hill versus a 4-bedroom home in Werribee. It's not an option for them. So it's a really interesting point in the cycle, and some transformative change needs to be done to make sure the affordability levels are maintained. And we talk about changes that are coming in, and at Burbank, we build 1,200-ish homes a year over Australia. So we're at the forefront of that, and a lot of some of it's in middle ring, a lot of it's on the fringes. So it's generally sort of first, second home buyer market. So people who have low income thresholds, average household income in Melbourne's like 130, 140,000. So their borrowing capacity is sort of sub 800 grand. To go and introduce things like NCC changes, the cost of that on the consumer is substantial. And we can debate over what the numbers are. There's 2 elements. There's the accessibility provisions and the sustainability provisions, all up, depending on the orientation of the house, probably 30 or 40 grand. It's a material, that's the difference between getting into the market or not getting into the market at a point when costs have been, last year costs on housing went up 17%. So it's a material impact on the consumer who's trying to.
Would it help if the houses that we're building are smaller?
Well, it is already reducing. There's discussion around that. I think the timing of these changes is really, really important. The Victorian Government pushed it out 6 months, so that's acknowledging the situation in the market. But it's not only a cost on the consumer; it's a cost on the industry at a point when the industry is in turmoil to resource and change every product design they've got in their market to be NCC compliant. So I think when there's discussion on design changes, there needs to be some realization on when the market's at, and that's not only the consumer market, it's the market who's delivering the product and where there's capacity to make these changes. And specific to some of these, I think we're at a real on a knife edge, particularly in Victoria at the moment, and it's a difficult time to accommodate these changes. And I think that's exacerbating the pressure through the supply chain on being able to accommodate it.
We're sort of it appears to me like it's a funnel with all these population growth coming to the established towns we have, and it just can't get outside the nozzle. It's all constricted around the bottom of the funnel.
Yeah, well, there's at the other end of the scale, there's obviously pressures on the lending environment. So the interest costs have gone up. Most of the stock in Melbourne is held by private people owning one rental dwelling. And the average rental stock across Melbourne is 6,000 less right now than the 10-year norm. So people can't get a rental. We've got record overseas migration into Australia, into Melbourne. Can't get a rental. It goes towards the new build market.
It's a nutty problem, isn't it? Yeah.
Pete, can I just finish on a little bit of something you started on the conversation with about the change in regulations? I guess we see it at the very forefront in our profession because that's what we do. We have to absorb these things, we have to understand. And the changes were about to happen, and a lot of them are very much for the better of the future of the planet. The reason these things are happening is because as a nation, we have been very far behind on climate change initiatives and the general standard of the construction of our buildings when they're compared to some other countries. So a lot of this is catch up. And I think part of the frustration, I think for a lot of us, is this catch up environment. We seem to be reactive. Everything's a bit sort of after the event. We need to fix this and then we need to fix that, rather than, taking a longer term view of the things that we need to do and where we want to be. So I think a lot of these things, they're quite confronting, but they're also very exciting. Like the very fact that a facade in a building now is not a simple thing, Peter, now. Like
there's a new profession called facade engineers.
And it's partly due to the problems with the cladding systems, but it's also environmental. It's just the way the facade has to perform in terms of fire rating, insulation values, condensation, aesthetics.
Acoustics.
Yeah, exactly. So it's building has got very complex, and when you see it done well, it's exciting, but there's a lot of catch up.
Let's talk about value. We're talking about the logistics and the nuts and bolts, but there's also value around emotional and monetary value. This was brought up in the Melbourne University study as a major issue. So, and one of the elements that was brought up was that it was a vortex of time, cost, and quality swirling around, trying to deliver value. So, is the measure of success and profit simply a financial return? And where does emotional and environmental value sit in the pecking order? In other words, how do we factor in concerns such as good design, community benefits, sustainable outcomes, long-term returns, long-life buildings? That's an important one, and fairness and equity. And I suppose the question is, do buildings have to become just a commodity? And how do we measure value? Would anyone like to tackle that?
Yeah, that's a nutty one, Peter. And I think for those of us in the profession that value design and the contribution that we see made to society at large through good design, then it's a little bit of a no-brainer in a way that it's the demonstration that we see all the time that good design does bring benefit to society. And I guess the points that Kirsten was making in her introduction are really important here, is some return to accountability, integrity, and an understanding of why we do what we do. Isn't like I think a lot of what I see at the moment is reform about the industry, not about an understanding of the people we serve, which is society at large. So I think there needs to be a reset, a refocus in some of the language and some of the way in which the tasks ahead of us, the reforms include the idea of the social society that we live in and the values that we're meant to deliver for them. It's not just a construction issue.
I'm wondering whether the value is Australians have an idea that is different in our generation to the past generation. In my experience, we're very happy to turn over a house and move on to the next one, whereas our parents and their parents, it was long-term investment in a place and in building stock, and it was valued for it being there. We're very happy to demolish and move on in this country, and it's got to do a little bit about the permanence of building, but I don't think we're really valuing the impost on the environment by knocking something down and rebuilding it. And there's also an emotional value connecting to place, which is not something in regulation, and it's not something that the government's probably focusing on, but it's a very important thing for society, where we feel connected and we feel that there's something intergenerational about the buildings we're putting up. And I guess, is it about time and cost, or is it about something else?
To me, there's also that age-old saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, in the sense that value is going to mean different things to different people. And I think, you've spoken, Peter, from that architectural lens around what goes into a building and what it's there to serve, and the community and things like that. But for some other people, the value is just simply going to be getting into the market. And so for them, it's that entry level. It doesn't need to be the most beautifully architecturally designed place. It is more a roof over a head and trying to solve for a need. And then I think there is also a change that's going on in society, which is starting to look at from a building and construction perspective around what goes into a building, how do we make it more resilient in the future, how would you deconstruct that building, where do those products come from, etc. And so there is a change in mindset, but we're just not at the forefront of that yet, and it's going to be a slower process because some of that is going to come at a cost to bring about that sort of climate change into a building environment.
And Tom, do people buy the sort of houses that Burbank are proposing solely on cost, or is there another agenda that's deeper than that?
No, I've worked across all sectors of the market, with corporates, with privates, entry level to the absolute premium level, and I think I think there's a bit of a misconception around developers and builders and their intentions in this space, and I think there's a bit of work to be done around the public narrative around that, and particularly it hasn't helped what's happened through the industry in the last couple of years. So I think as a collective, there's some work to be done around what we're all trying to achieve. And I think in relation to the things that you talked about, I think most developers would aspire for those things. But I get back to, and Michaela touched on it well, it's understanding your market and different markets want different things. So understanding your market, being able to articulate that in your development or your built form and delivering to your market and communicating it effectively, then projects will be successful. And that means different things for different people. So it's not a one size fits all approach.
Let's talk about knowledge, knowledge that we have when we're fresh out of university and what we pick up along the way. Are we training our construction industry workers well enough? And this is across all sectors. Are students obtaining sufficient knowledge to enable confident practice? Do students learn the necessary skills for practice? And I don't think Alan Pert's here, is he? He's lucky. He's going to get away with it because I was going to put him out on this question. So there's issues on technical, financial, professional, documentation, people skills. Should we return to a more formal type of apprenticeship model, for architects as well? Or examples like in medicine, we have clinical learning and legal or apprenticeships and interns. So the question is, how do we develop our skills and knowledge base through education? How do we teach agility and resilience for those in both the professions and the trades?
Well, okay, start down this end. I observe both as a long-term person connected with the profession, the working profession, as well as in academic life, teaching in architecture schools for a long time. And I think the really important thing here is that universities have a very particular role in teaching creative thinking and resilience and other factors, not just, it's almost impossible to teach what happens in practice. And that needs to happen in conjunction with practice. So when you say apprenticeship, it's effectively what happens when we always have students in our offices, many practices will, and you just see the way in which they grow in their knowledge by doing the work and being exposed to it. And that's not really the place for a university, I don't believe. I think they're there to teach people how to think. And architects are not very good at writing. They could probably do better at that. And the rest comes from exposure to actually doing what we do. So I think if that isn't formalized, then maybe it needs to be or whatever. But I just think you learn by doing. And yeah.
So that's the architectural area. Michaela, in building, what I've noticed is that trades don't cross over the boundaries. When Pete and I started practice, you go to the builder and anyone would help out. They'd be able to do a little bit of help the plaster if he needed it. There's a strict demarcation now between what trades will do and what they're educated to do. Do you see an issue there?
Yeah, look, I think there's an industrial relations landscape, which on some sites will be driving the, you stick to your lane, I'll stick to my lane scenario. But I think also if we look at from an apprenticeship rate perspective, only 50% of those who enter into an apprenticeship in the building construction industry actually complete it. So there's a lot of work that needs to go on in addition to assisting employers to actually make that apprenticeship whilst they're on the work site valuable. Because if we have an apprentice that comes to work every day and all they're doing is the same thing for 4 years, we haven't actually given them the broad enough education and experience so that when they go out as a licensed trade, for example, that they can actually do the whole spectrum of what you would expect, be it a sparky, a plumber, etc., to be able to do. So there is that element that we need to get better at, the on-site component. We need to give employers more incentives to actually engage and employ apprentices as well, because it does take more time out of your day to go and educate and make sure that that person is going to, at the end of their apprenticeship, be qualified and actually have an understanding of what they need to do on the job. And so incentives there from an employer perspective would add value to try and get more apprenticeships through the system.
I think we talk about this a lot internally, the impact and particularly with home warranty insurance in Victoria and the length of that. So the learnings post completion and how that's passed back into not only delivery but into the design phase. And I think as an industry we've got a lot to learn in that space. I think warranty work for the last 9-10 years of a job, the value, the capture of knowledge in that really doesn't happen in a structured way. We spend a lot of time trying to get that, trying to influence, how we build our homes and how we design our homes and how we build our homes. But as an industry, I think there's a bit of a way to go in that space. I think more broadly, and Michaela obviously sits on an industry body. Outside my day-to-day role, I sit on an industry body as well, and I think industry and representative bodies come together well to discuss with government, key policy issues or building reform or whatever, how that could be better linked with academia and research to actually understand the impacts of reform, impacts of policy changes, and bring that into the day-to-day sort of debate. I think is an opportunity for the industry more broadly.
Just one more thing there, thinking about that, this task of going onto building sites. I've observed a big shift in the way, like I think many of us have, in the way building sites are run, and how as you said, how strictly the trades all stay in their own little lane. And we've had a recent experience going on. So contractor turns up, put the windows in, mate, where are the flashings? Not my problem. And builder sitting in the shed. It's sort of like there is a sort of chronic problem in the industry where there is just everyone staying in their lane and not really being particularly concerned about the totality of what they're doing. And for us, this is a constant frustration. You can't be there all the time, and a lot of the problems that are coming up, on sites like poor flashing or things not happening, are because of that fundamental problem.
How do you explain that, Michaela? Given that there is a builder supposedly overseeing a project, how are things like that missed out, overlooked? Is it about pricing? It's a pricing issue. They can't afford the extra site supervisor to be looking what the trades are doing.
I could blame the project management firms that are in the middle, but
Oh, good.
no, look, I think we're stretching ourselves so thin just in general. And so you're not necessarily going to have those eyes on the project all the time, and you're potentially leaving people with the expectation that they're going to have completed that particular work up to a certain point. And I think communication is key. That's partly letting us down as well. If you're not talking to and making sure that everybody knows on site where their job starts and finishes, this is how some of these gaps end up occurring.
You're talking about knowledge, and I think there's a distinct lack of knowledge in the community about what people do on a building site and the importance of the various roles. They're just looking at a price, not realizing that cutting out personnel means lack of quality control.
I'd also say going back to risk is another thing, which is why some people sit there and go, I could go and do that, but that's not what I've been engaged to do. I've been asked to do this particular part of the project. And if I go and touch that, then what's going to happen to me if something goes wrong with that bit? So there's this risk side as well that I think is slipping into the industry.
Before I ask my final question, I'd just like to ask if anyone would like to pose a question to the panellists. There's a gentleman just up here on my right, very quick with his hand up. You'll come second, Jeff, don't worry. There's a gentleman just on the stairs there, perhaps. Could someone, here we've got a microphone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the lovely debate. My name is F.A. I'm a developer and I teach at Melbourne Uni, subject called property development. So my question goes to Tom. All the good developers I spoke to, and I'm not saying good or bad, but there's a good emphasis on everybody I work with asking to regulate, increase the energy efficiency. 7 natters is not that great. I lived overseas. I never wake up cold in my life till I moved to Melbourne. So my question is, sure, it has a little bit upfront cost, but don't you feel responsible to teach and educate your customers? The more money you pay now means you wake up comfortable, you sleep comfortable, and you don't wake up cold, and you save money on your power bills because the cost of energy is through the roof now. So that additional cost, I mean, could be educating the customer. So do you feel responsible in that sense?
Oh, we're like, there's a responsibility across the industry to deliver, and there's a few components in, because what's come in, like I talked about the NCC earlier, there's sustainability requirements, which is one component, and there's accessibility requirements. I think you know, talking to the sustainability requirements, the tools to actually measure the rating tool on the home is not actually released by the government yet. Yet we're talking about, or we were talking about implementing legislation that came in from October 1st. And I think South Australia and West Australia have kicked it out a couple of years. Queensland, there's still debate on whether it will go ahead on October 1st or not. So there's a cost on the consumer and an ability to be able to do that. And clearly there's got to be a transition towards that. I don't think there's any debate around whether it should come in. It's how quickly it should come in and the customer's ability to pay. I think that the broader issue and what people haven't looked at, there's an impact on the home, there's an impact on the development, more broadly, orientation of lots, small lot sizes, fall on lots. So grade issues have issues with accessibility. And the work that is required by industry to actually assess that, amend their developments, amend their homes at a point when the market is under considerable strain, is difficult. So I don't think you would not go to a builder and developer, I don't think, in Victoria that says it's a bad thing. It's a question around timing and understanding of the challenges that the market and the customers are facing at the moment.
Because Tom, it's currently NAFTA's 6, it's going to go to 7. And that extra step up is a fairly financial, it's a big impost.
Yeah, it is. It depends. So it is. The accessibility provisions sort of double down on that. It depends on the orientation of the home as well, and there's things like, particularly on the built form. So depending on slope on the land, the size of the lot, there are certain provisions around step downs within garage grade outside the home that will be difficult to meet, or widths of hallways that will be difficult to meet on certain products. So there'd be an element of product that's sitting on the ground or under construction now that might not be able to accommodate an NCC compliant product. So definitely there would be no debate about the end game. It's around transition and timing.
Kayla?
I think one other thing to add to that is that you can design and you can build a 7-star rated home, you know, up the star rating up. But if at the end of the day that homeowner doesn't use that house in the way that it was designed to be used, and that's as simple as, do you have the windows open? Do you have the windows shut? Do you dry your clothes inside your house versus outside your house? All of these things are going to affect, even though you might have designed the perfect star rated house.
We're never
you've got
going to
people
educate
using it.
all people, unfortunately. Humans will be humans.
We can try.
Any other question, Jeff?
Yeah, look, my question is sort of builds on the last one a little bit. And it's really around, I mean, we have a climate crisis coming towards us. It's going to get hotter and hotter. And one of the challenges that we face, you know, as my friend over here was talking about it being cold, it's the same issue. It's insulation, it's airtightness of buildings. And I suppose my question is for the panel to say, what does the industry need to do around education for designers to be able to design for detailing for insulation and airtightness, and equally, you know, do we need to start bringing in things that allow builders to celebrate the great success in the quality of their building? So what I mean by that is that, you know, when you get a house handed over to you, currently at the moment, you'll go and get an electrical certificate to make sure, you know, your hair doesn't go when you put your finger in, or a plumbing certificate to make sure things don't leak. You know, do you think we should bring in, as is standard in other countries, an airtightness certificate to show that the builder has done a really top job of detailing the doors and the windows and so on, and has sealed gaps up, and then can celebrate the fact that they've done such a good job, and to give some certitude to the building owner that actually they're buying a well-insulated airtight building. And complementary to that, it might be thermography or photographs of the insulation in the walls, which goes into what was talked about before, that handover product, that people can actually see what they're getting. because plasterboard and roofing sheet hides 1,000 sins.
So
So I'm interested in that kind of, your thoughts on that kind of training and also quality assurance to be able to be sure that people's biggest investment is getting what they're paid for.
Well, I'll start a little bit. Just recently came back from a country where the rent advertisements in the window gave the annual energy consumption figure. So not only was the rent, the area, and a few other facts, but it also gave the energy consumption.
sorry, Pete, the rent.
Yeah, no, well, the advertisements for renting
Oh, I see.
an apartment
Yep.
or a building, it was compulsory to show the energy consumption of the building. I think in some ways there is already this is already happening, Jeff. It's just we probably need to separate the housing market a little bit from other general public buildings and so on, where this is happening already. But there is a huge need for upskilling. Insulation's a classic example where it was just done by labourers, and it's probably the most important thing you can do to your building is to make sure that it's done properly and that it's certified. So I understand what the problem is here, and it's yet more impost on the industry and the way things are built. But ultimately, if we want to get the standard buildings to where they need to be environmentally, then that's something that's going to happen.
I think on the volume building game, I won't sort of add to the comments around inside the house, but outside the house, and we have real challenges. Particularly, you mentioned earlier about houses getting smaller, and particularly frontages getting smaller, and authorities have requirements around spatial separation between trees, vegetation, and electrical, gas, water, and even on side boundaries, proximity of trees that might otherwise undermine a slab. That space has shifted considerably in recent years, and then you couple that with council requirements around parking on small lots. I think the ability to green outside the home, and particularly in not just in the front yard but in the nature strip, is getting really, really difficult. And I think, when we talk about the overall environmental solution, greening our communities is fundamental to try to drive that. And I reckon there's a lack of, because it's a compliance sort of society, so everyone wants their distance, no one wants their services to be undermined, but there's only so much, and we've got a situation where homes are getting smaller to address affordability, and something's got to give in that space, or we'll have hardscaped front nature strips, which is not good for anyone.
What's the average size of a home that you're building?
Well, land size, and generally people try and maximize the footprint of the home on the land, but when I started developing in Melbourne, the average land size on the fringe of Melbourne was probably 500 square meters. Talked about, will it ever get to 400? It got to 400. And then, quite quickly, it's probably 350 now, but it's pretty normal, particularly, when the Victorian Planning Authority started bringing in densities 10-ish years ago, it was 12 dwellings a hectare, moved to 15 dwellings a hectare. The discussion now is 28 dwellings a hectare. So it's moved very quickly in the space of a decade. Part of that's affordability, and part of it's just trying to maximize development within the urban growth boundary to leverage the infrastructure within.
It's also, isn't it, incumbent on the government to provide somewhere where the kids can now kick a footy?
Yeah.
They're not going to do it in the backyard.
Oh, well, there's provisions obviously within structure plans that provide that. So I think, and all that's taken into account, at the front end of the cycle. The challenge is, we're sort of going from a step change between the same provisions on open space and social infrastructure, but we're trying to double our densities through the growth areas to maximise development within the urban growth footprint. So what that really looks like in a real context is probably 7 or 8 years ago on the fringes, there's probably 5% of dwellings delivered, sort of say sub 8 metre frontage, townhouse development 5 to 7.5, 8 metre frontages. That's shifted to about 15% now, and I think over the next 5 years that'll be more like 30%.
Good. So, one more question. If I could get a microphone to Ted Value, please. This will be the last question. We better be good, Ted.
I fear you're going to want me to shut up. But I'm going to ask a very simple question and just give a little bit of background. What will it take for the professions involved in the building industry to speak the truth and to speak up?
Which
Because
particular
most-
truth you're talking about?
Sorry?
Which particular truth?
The reality of, well, put it this way. You mentioned understanding and accountability. We have the highest construction costs in the world, but we don't have the best buildings. When we did the cladding inquiry, we went out and proactively audited, and we found the cladding problems. We found all the other problems as well. And I insisted that the inquiry be bipartisan, and John Thwaites and I insisted on this. We found numerous other systemic defects. And we were encouraged to stay in our lane and not mention it. We insisted in the reports that they at least be mentioned. Those defects, some have said in the industry that some of those defects will be worse than cladding. Now, this is not just an Australian problem. It's a worldwide problem. The industry has a worldwide problem, and I'm involved in the battle in the UK. They call it the building safety crisis there. But nobody wants to speak up. Nobody wants to face the inevitable. Because if this industry was building ships or planes, people would be in jail. And we're not doing it the way we should be doing it. And in terms of understanding, so there's an accountability issue. And everybody in the industry I speak to knows about it, but no one wants to speak up because they want to keep their heads down. On understanding, we have a major problem with the planning system in this state and elsewhere. It's based on an assumption, which is derived from a lack of understanding by decision makers. The cost of construction is differential. For high density, it's much more substantial than for cottage construction. And what's that led to? I missed all.
Is that your phone talking to you?
It said time to shut up.
Can I just
Can I just finish this point quickly? That differential cost of construction is led to the planning system encouraging what's now a family donut. From a consumer point of view, young families don't have much of a choice. Go down to Abbotsford and try and find a 3-bedroom apartment in the thousands of apartments built down there. If they can't afford it. Young families can't afford to be in medium density, high density development. And they're going to the fringes. And the lot sizes are shrinking. And the other part of that is, you mentioned household side, Pete. And Melbourne 2030, when it was one of its missions, was to lower the number of people per household. And we've gone from 3 down to about 2.5. And I know that there are planners who want that to come down further. The Reserve Bank in the last month has been calling for that number to go up. There's a lack of understanding of what we're actually achieving with the policy announcements that are made by people who are often ill-informed. And why would they be informed? Most politicians wouldn't have a clue. And until we get some accountability for the industry and some understanding, we're just going to be chasing our errors forever. And I would simply say to people, as I've been saying for years, please speak up, start shouting. These quiet professions are part of the problem because people are too scared to speak up.
Can I be? Thank you, Ted. Can I just throw that back to Andrew, who's sitting 2 rows behind you? Is the he's sighing? He's fallen to a heap. I'm wondering whether this is part of the government's agenda to try and understand these issues, and with the new Reform Act, which was just passed last month, is the government cognizant of the foibles and faults of the industry, and are they trying to address some of the issues that that Ted just brought up? No, you can give him the microphone. He's not going to get out of it that easy.
Firstly, remember, I'm not a politician, so.
But you are from the Ministry
given
of
me
Planning, the Ministry of
given
Planning
me
Walks.
a challenge, though. Yes, I believe it is. In terms of the expert panel on building reform, that's been out. There's many people in this room that have been in conversations about that information. It's a matter of that information getting to decision makers and then decisions being made. I'm in a lot of conversations every single day where I agree with Ted. There are a lot of people with a lot of very, very good ideas. It's a matter of those good ideas being agreed to as a community and then moving forward with them. The other thing is that we are, and I said this recently at an ALBS meeting, and I want to pick up on what one of the other people said, and that was, could I please wake up one day and actually have a good news building story? I'm tired of it. Why are we not collectively celebrating the good things which are out there? Because there are good things out there, and good breeds good. But there's not enough good getting out into the media because the media only like bad news stories.
Thank you. And that is a great segue to wrapping up this session, because I was going to try and put a positive spin on tonight. You know, perhaps the reform process we're talking about should be driving change, not following change, and wondering whether there's a better balance between fixing poor performance and defects with new horizons, using information now available on issues like climate change. And there's some great, as you mentioned, there's some great examples of exemplary projects in Australia, celebrated in the various awards programs, with high quality outcomes, healthy buildings that are working towards net zero and low embodied energy targets, all talking to exciting times ahead. And I want to pose a question to you all in turn, and I'll start with you, Tom, rather than with Pete, who has been the brunt of the question answering tonight. How do we harness these aspirations with a non-partisan, perhaps a non-political organisation that will foster policy conversation between all stakeholders across the built environment? And I guess that's what Ted was intimating, is how you harness all these issues in a positive way and look forward and taking I guess stock of our mistakes.
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally on the positive side, we don't have a demand issue. Like Australia through COVID and Melbourne in particular, even despite all the challenges, we have record numbers of people wanting to move here to live. So that's a great opportunity for the state on how we work together to house them all. So I think we're coming from fundamentally a position of strength, because I just look at markets. If there's strong demand, then it's how we work together to sort of unlock the supply to address that demand. Clearly, we've got challenges, and I think, Ted, your question was spot on. You know, Michaela obviously leads a representative board. I lead a representative board outside the day job. I don't think there is a willingness of people wanting to get together to voice their opinions. I think it's been a challenging environment being heard, and there's fatigue around that. But clearly, we've just got to keep on working together. I think there's an opportunity, I touched on it earlier, but to better link the concerns that I think when industry, and that's why industry representative organisations are quite important, because individual developers or builders might not want to voice their opinions. They do it through a representative group and share it through that forum. So I think that's a really important forum. I still think there's a level of cynicism within government around the intentions of representative groups, and I don't know where that's comes from, but I think it just needs to be stopped. But I think maybe to help with that, there's an opportunity for research and academia to come together with industry representative groups to maybe better position those arguments from a policy position to help government understand the decisions they're making. So, you know, how we do that and how quickly we do that are sort of probably separate questions, and we're not going to probably solve that tonight. But I don't think, Ted, there's a there's a lack of people willing to put their hand up. It's just there's fatigue around it, and a perception issue around those voices being heard.
I'll probably add on to a little bit of what Tom said. And at Master Builders, we just recently launched off the back of an international research project, and we'd worked with, and I shouldn't say it within the walls of Melbourne Uni here, but we worked with RMIT on that.
It's okay.
on that. We're happy to work with others. But we worked with them on this international research project to really have a look at what are other countries doing and how can we bring Victoria and the construction industry to the forefront. And from an innovation perspective, also looking at regulation and how we get all the parties together. And when we released that report about a month ago, a lot of the feedback in the room was how good it was to have academia, industry, and government all actually collectively talking about the same issues that we all want to solve together. And I think that's the important part. We need to find what are the issues that together all those parties come for, and then as a force, we'll have a lot better chance for change.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, well put. I agree. Can I just add one little thing towards the end here? For those of you that suffered through the Four Corners program on Monday night, I think one of the things that is pretty evident in the bad behaviour in parts of the industry is the lack of prosecution, the lack of accountability from people who are just doing very bad things and constantly doing it again and again. And, you know, I think for all of us who value integrity and reputations, they are earned. And when you lose them, they're very hard to get back and convince society that we are worthy of these things. And I think for a lot of people, there's an immense frustration in the bad news, knowing that there's a lot of very good work going on, very excited about the future, great initiatives in climate change. We have wonderful construction industry generally. But there is a problem. We're not dealing with the problems. They just keep coming back. So until there's some stronger attempt to actually fix that problem, we are going to constantly have bad news in the paper, unwelcome as it is, because I think overall we've got a more positive environment. And I like what's being said here about, you know, reducing the silo thing and more research, more science behind what we do, making that evident to government. We're here to help. You know, it's not like we're here to help.
Thanks, Pete. And if you'd all help me thank the panelists and the people in the audience that have contributed, that'd be terrific. And I'll just hand back to Kirsten to wrap up. Thank you very much, everybody.
Again, thanks to the panel and also to the Association of Consulting Architects for their support in putting tonight's event on. I have also, you'd think by now I would know how to use one of these. Right. I'd also like to mention a couple of our current and upcoming programs here in the faculty. We have the Alumni Series exhibition, which is on now, Thinking of You, Projects by MGS Architects, is now open in the Dulux Gallery. So there's a number of associated floor talks and panel discussions with that. We also have two upcoming online public lectures, Street, Who Owns the City, which will be presented by London-based architect Peter Barber on the 7th of August at 8 p.m. And also Housing, Spatial, Social and Material, which will be presented by, I'm going to completely massacre this name, sorry, Aldrosa De Clever from De Clever Gregoric Architects, a Ljubljana-based architecture studio on the 15th of August at 6 p.m. Also on our website, MSD UniMelb EDU events, we have lots of details for these events and also other upcoming ones. So thank you again, and please join us in the foyer for some light refreshments, and I hope you all have a good evening. Thanks.